Didn't play a lot of new releases in 2023, if only because I wasn't playing popular titles from the year in order to gain traction as I was doing a lot in 2022. Most of my time was spent playing older games, and many of them were far better than anything that came out this year could have been. There's not much else preface to be written on this. If you've seen my last two videos on the subject, you already have some idea of what's going to be here. Let's just get into talking about the games. If I've already made a video on the subject or written a backlog piece on it, then it won't be present here. To start off the year was Dynasty Warriors VIII, a game I played while over at someone else's house with him because I was curious about the PS3 games he had that I wouldn't be able to easily emulate back at home. Dynasty Warriors VIII stood out as a game to play because it was one that we could both play together. We didn't get through the entire game, but it was pretty fun for what it was. Dynasty Warriors games generally tend to be pretty brainless affairs, at least the ones that stick to the main Musou formula. Just a pulpy retelling of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Not exactly anything special, but fun enough, especially with someone you care about playing with you. The worst thing I can say about this game is that some of the dialogue can get pretty grating, but it's easily ignored in favor of the mindless combat. Another game I played on the PS3 while at his house. Very interesting take on the platform fighter as a genre, and honestly I can't really put my finger on why people hate this game so much. The main differentiation between the platform fighter Super Smash Bros. That the player has to use the super finisher to kill their opponent is not a particularly fun change. But I don't think it ruins the game, just as how many of Smash's elements aren't very fun, but the game ends up being decent overall. The cast of characters is funny to see now, seeing how so many of these games in the series have been abandoned, but there's a lot of genuine enjoyment to be had from playing as someone like Sir Daniel Fortescue from Medieval in this bizarro alternate universe version of Smash Bros. The main highlight is the mechanic where stages cross over with each other, the funniest mixture being the Patapon stage halfway through getting cut open to reveal Metal Gear Ray and the cityscapes from the beginning stage of Metal Gear Rising. A very entertaining game to play with someone else. I've had a turbulent time getting into the Souls games, having attempted to play through Dark Souls when I was in middle school and never quite getting into it despite getting fairly far into the game. This was due to a confluence of factors surrounding my friend group at the time and the context in which I played it, but nevertheless I have always associated Dark Souls with some painful and frustrating memories. That being said, I attempted to play the original Demon's Souls as the third game on that PS3 I was trying out games on. I got to Phalanx before giving up. While I don't think Souls is as difficult as people say it is, I struggle with it for some psychological reason that I still haven't been able to ascertain. There's something about the feedback on attacks and movement that drives me mad. Demon's Souls was an experience I preferred to Dark Souls overall, though, and that was largely due to the presentation. Demon's Souls, or at least what I played of it, is much prettier than its sequels. Some of the most interesting color grading that I've seen out of FromSoft's Ovra, which already has some of the best looking AAA games of the past decade. It's definitely a game I want to revisit, mainly because my girlfriend is a huge fan, but I don't know if I'll be able to overcome the mental barriers I associate with the series. A portrait of a ruined, desolate world that I would like to reappraise. Pentiment is the first game on this list that I actually completed, and it's a complex one to discuss. It's historical fiction set in 1500s Germany within a rural town, one that we see change over the course of 3 decades through 2 different perspectives. The game takes the form of an adventure game visual novel, and it's one of the better written games that I've played simply from a prosaic standpoint. Visually, it's also fairly standout. It expertly imitates the kind of 16th century illustrations that will be drawn by our main character and his contemporaries. The way the town's politics evolve in reaction to your choices and how characters change in relation to your perception of them are intensely satisfying to see over the course of the generations, and the web that is formed from every piece of the puzzle is one of the most interesting I've seen in a video game. The town has a real palpable sense of place to it. My only real complaint is the game's ending, which I find to be a little silly. While I do ultimately enjoy Pentiment to the point that I would say it's one of my all-time favorite games, I do think that, like many Western indie games of the past decade, it could have concluded on a better note. The reveal that all the murders in the town were by a mysterious puppet master operating from within ancient Roman ruins felt like a departure from what the rest of the game had been going for, and the idea that any meaningful change would have been made socially from the entire affair was also fairly silly. The most egregiously strange twist is the main character of the first two parts being revealed to have secretly survived his death at the end of Part 2 and rejoining the new protagonist during Part 3. Nothing that ruins the game, however, and I understand how hard it can be to stick the landing of a narrative, especially one this ambitious. A pretty damn near perfect impression of 16th century rural Germany, and the harrowing and beautiful ways that time shapes and changes us as people. The Genesis project is a game I played with an ex-girlfriend I don't talk to anymore. It's a weird experience to have with the game. It's become a digital corpse that was once inhabited by a connection. That aside, the game itself was fine. It's a bit of an interesting translation of Spurb into an actual video game, much like something like the Overseer project was in a text-based form years ago. However, this lacks that game's depth by necessity as it's an audio-visual experience. It is cool to see what kind of kernel sprites and alchemical items you can make, even if there isn't as much of a variety as something text-based could allow you. It's a pretty fun game, all things considered, even though it feels bleak to play it now. Suvanux is an obscure text-based adventure game from the late aughts, and it's kind of a fascinating design object. It's largely a puzzle box where the main discovery is found in finding new ways to manipulate the game's fictional language to cast spells and escape the room the player is trapped in. It's pretty fun if you're into that sort of thing, I would assume, but sadly I'm not particularly invested in it. The prose is not particularly compellingly written either. It's a cute distraction, but nothing intriguing. Psycolonials is a difficult work to talk about. It is the thematic continuation of Homestuck's ideas, one of the many sequels to that work. It's in large part about the experiences of being the author of Homestuck and what that meant and continues to mean for Andrew Hussey, who also wrote this game. Under this reading, the game sucks pretty bad, considering Andrew Hussey is not a very good person, and a lot of the supposed turmoil that they have faced is something they reckoned upon themselves. That aside, I do think Psycolonials stands on its own narratively in many ways outside of that. There is a genuine horror in creating something larger than yourself and allowing it to consume you, even if it is a righteous cause. Aesthetically, it is one of the ugliest games I have ever played in the most interesting ways possible. The way the mixed media comes together forms ugly compositions that reflect the dissonant nature of the narrative in some brilliant ways. Homestuck used the same techniques to much more aesthetically pleasing effect, but here it feels as if you're inside the rotting mind of our main protagonist. The writing takes a lot of cues from Homestuck, which is one of the best written works of literature of all time, so it's fairly good in this, although it never reaches the same height. The soundtrack is also stellar, but there was no question there considering the Homestuck lineage. Bonus points for featuring a semi-successful socialist revolution within the text, though some taken off for being an anarchist one. Played this over the course of a few days, and it embarrassingly made me feel such revolutionary anger that I was scared of it. A game I played with the aforementioned ex-girlfriend who said it was one of its favorite games prior to me playing it. Another digital corpse, though this one has far less for me inherently. I often dismiss the critique of art being edgy, viewing it as reductive. This critique is often levied at works such as Drakengard or Final Fantasy VIII or The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, all games that I deeply admire. That aside, Sally faces the kind of edge that I despise. Mean-spirited and gratuitously violent in its construction, with an utter nonsense plot about mass murder, suicide, and the occult. It's an adventure game with fairly standard puzzles, nothing to write home about. The only thing it has going for it is its presentation, which is rough around the edges in a pretty interesting way, and the developers choose to experiment with it in some fairly fun ways throughout. The soundtrack is also pretty cool. It's funny to play in an ironic sense, but looking for something genuinely meaningful in it is unlikely to bear any fruit. No greater grief than to remember days of joy when misery is at hand. I've gone on record as not enjoying the Mega 10 games all too much, with Persona 4 being my personal least favorite video game ever made. I've played Nocturne before, and though I enjoyed some of its systems on a surface level, I wasn't particularly compelled by anything other than the atmosphere. I also played Shin Megami Tensei 4, as you know from last year. This was a similar case to those two games. Much like its sequels from 20 years in the future, Megami Tensei on the Famicom has a palpable sense of atmosphere, the twisting identical hallways giving the entire thing a monotonous, macabre feel. It also has a tight gameplay loop featuring demon fusion and experimentation with new party compositions, though it also harbors the classic Mega 10 issue where trying to figure out if a team member is worth the investment or not requires an immense amount of trial and error. The bare-bones narrative did little to compel me further through its endless cavernous depths. The classic dilemma of the Megami Tensei game. Overall, one of the better entries in the series out of what I've played thus far. A game I played with someone with the hopes that we would write a hit piece on Supergiant's catalog in the future together to be posted on this very channel, though that never came to fruition. Even though it and a game I will speak of soon came to represent a sadness at the writings that never were, Transistor was already a solid work. Just one that I used to have more fun poking fun at. Transistor is much like every other Supergiant game in almost every respect. It has a high production value, yet a paradoxically bland and discordant art style. It has boring gameplay that attempts to integrate itself into the narrative in really heavy-handed ways, neoliberal propaganda as its beating heart and soul, and actually a fairly good soundtrack. I would say that Transistor probably has my favorite soundtrack of all the games, and aside from the aforementioned game I'm going to talk about soon, I do generally like Supergiant soundtracks. It helps that the main character is a singer, so we get a lot of the lyrical tracks that I think Supergiant excels at compared to their more purely instrumental work. That's the only real point of praise I can give the game, however. Transistor centers around a typical strawman of authoritarianism, a YA novel, the Giver-esque dystopia in which people vote on what color the sky is, which is seen as really horrible for some reason, and where machines have assimilated everyone to a collectivist whole. Really though, while the stuff is fairly egregious on its own, anti-communist and all, that would be pretty standard fare for Supergiant. What pushes this over the edge to be the most insanely bad game of the bunch is its ending, where instead of reshaping the world with a new opportunity she's been given, our main protagonist commits suicide to live inside the Transistor forever. I could see this conclusion working in a different narrative, but the context here, a woman literally deprived of her voice and agency giving up her literal life to be with a man, is just grossly misogynistic. It doesn't help that all the villains in the game are gay, but the main characters are straight, which is self-evidently a pretty bad choice. The gameplay isn't much better, though there is a lot of depth to it that I didn't see on my playthrough. The faux turn-based yet faux action mechanics do have intrigue on paper, but the narrative never makes you use them beyond just mashing a singular button over and over. Perhaps if I had done the game's mini challenges I would have found something fascinating about it, but knowing Supergiant systems that would unlikely be the case. The final boss fight, where the person you're fighting emulates your powers and the game becomes fully turn-based, is pretty cool though. The game semi-co-ops the Drakengard weapon story as well, with each piece of equipment granting you more access to information about the characters whose those pieces of equipment used to be. The difference between that and this, however, is that Drakengard's weapon stories are well written and add interesting texture to the world, myths and fables that give a realm of legend even more mystique. Transistor's character bios are written like Wikipedia pages for ideas that don't matter to the rest of the game. Transistor is shockingly bad even for a studio that's notorious for making terrible games. Arguably one of my least favorite games ever made, all the issues of Supergiant compounded into a single whole. Second verse, same as the first, for the most part. Or I suppose in this case third verse, as I did skip Megami Tensei 2 for whatever reason I don't remember. Shin Megami Tensei is probably my favorite Mega 10 game, a very interesting piece of work compared to the others I have played. I find the entire Apocalypse portion to be probably the highlight of the entire series. I know it was impossible to guess that someone who likes Final Fantasy VI an awful lot would find a twist like that compelling. I'm still not super into a lot of the narrative choices it makes, but I do find it much more compelling than Nocturne or SMT4. The political discourse between Japan's own homegrown fascist ideologies and the United States' imperialist fascism imposed upon the country post-World War II implemented in the first half of the game is utterly fascinating. Again, Final Fantasy VI fan speaking. It's also gorgeous and the soundtrack is really great. Sadly, my personal playthrough of the game ended long before the parts that I find the most interesting. Due to a bug with the Aeon Genesis version of the translation, I couldn't buy guns and thus the game's difficulty was much harder than it was intended, which led to me dropping the game. I have seen the rest of the game, and from what I've seen, it's pretty cool. I think I'm cursed to never finish Mega 10 games, though. It's hard to say what I think about Hades without redundancy, something I found while writing the script for the video that I was going to collaborate with that person on. When discussing Supergiant's oeuvre, most of the issues are pervasive within all of their works. The tendencies toward neoliberal fascist nonsense, the odd takes on queer representation and identity, the generally fairly insufferable writing in a technically competent aesthetic direction that ends up clashing with itself. All of these issues are ones I take with Hades, but my main gripe that almost makes me say this is the worst of their games is simply the structure. I am known to be someone who dislikes roguelikes mostly on principle, but Hades in particular is a terrible format for the structure. The risk versus reward of the runs is entirely eschewed in favor of choices between different forms of meta-currency, most of the choices feeling the same within the run's context itself. Every run has nearly the same bosses, and while there is some variability with them, it's very easy to see all forms of them within a few runs. Its worst issue is that in order to see the game's narrative through to the end, you have to beat the game 10 times. With some roguelikes this isn't much issue, but in a game like Hades where there's incredibly little variety and runs take between 40 minutes and an hour, it becomes a tedious grind. While the reactivity of its dialogue systems is impressive from a technical perspective, it's largely just a form of making arbitrary references about your deeds. Really, most of the dialogue in the game is just an attempt at making the player think it's clever for being self-referential, which is a trend that sadly plagues the Western indie scene as a whole right now. Of course, the game's narrative about repairing a divorce is pretty strange on the face of it, but that's the least of its concerns. A game I have many bad memories of. I know I have made many statements already about how I think Mega 10 is a series that isn't for me, but that's never stopped me from trying new games and experiences. I thought the same about Metal Gear until this year, and I adore several of the games within that series. Same hat with Drakengard and NieR. That being said, I've played a lot of Mega 10 games at this point, and I think it's probably pretty safe to assume it's really just not my thing. Shin Megami Tensei If was the one I actually expected to like, if only because it's unpopular. There are many games considered the worst of the respective series that I end up liking far more than most people, Devil May Cry 2 being the best example, as it is my favorite Devil May Cry game and one of my favorite games ever made. However, when it comes to SMT If, I must sadly report that it is as bad as people say. It's tedium without anything interesting to go along with it, SMT1 without any of the ideas that game had. It's a reused mess of ideas, and it's curious that it even exists. Structurally very compelling at the very least, and it's kind of a shame that Atlus never returned to put a new spin on the different stories based on your partner character idea that was fairly underutilized in the century, as almost all the stories are identical with the exception of one. Most of Mega 10 I feel ambivalent toward, but Persona is a series that I utterly despise. I think it's one of the worst game series ever made, but there is a catch to this. Up until this year I had only played Persona 4, despite having a pretty extensive knowledge of 3 and 5. Persona 4 has been my most despised game of all time for a long time now. However, 5 has started to attempt to overtake that spot due to recent events. Several people I've dated this year have said the 2 Persona 2s were some of their all-time favorite games, so I decided to go through the series to play them. That was a large factor in why I played all those Mega 10 games. I wanted to play the Persona 2s. Unfortunately, I never finished Persona 1 due to a confluence of factors that happened during the summer that led to me losing interest in the endeavor entirely, but I'll probably revisit it eventually to get the Persona 2s out of the way once and for all. For the positives, I do think Persona 1 is a very pretty game, as most of the Mega 10 games are. I think the soundtrack is fairly good as well, which again is fairly standard for the series. That aside, the 10 or so hours of Persona 1 that I did play were pretty uncompelling narratively, and gameplay-wise similar to its descendants, it's easy to the point of boredom. There are many encounters, and they're all solved in just the same ways. MP is restored constantly, so there's almost no reason to not keep casting spells, and the bosses only ever ask for a slight change in strategy. It's a pretty boring game, but it's not actively destructive, which means it's better than Persona 4 and 5 at the very least. Adorable and profound visual novel. Pretty integral part of the trends from game canon and a game that everyone should play, especially if you're a trans woman. Explores internalized trans misogynistic ideologies from an optimistic perspective, ultimately arguing that the world has the capacity for good and betterment. Cutely illustrated and well composed on the soundtrack front. I didn't get any of the endings except the good one, but from what I hear, they're all fairly compelling narratively. While it retains the presentational qualities that I praised One Night Hot Springs for, I can't help but feel like Last Day of Spring feels a little aimless. It's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination, still fairly well written and entertaining, but its existence just feels kind of pointless. I do recommend playing it regardless, as it is cute. I have similar feelings on Spring Leaves No Flowers as I do Last Day of Spring. This year marked my actual foray into the Metal Gear games, even though I played a few of them for the first time when I was 15 and never finished them. Having said that, I played the first 3 prior to this again, and Ghost Babel I played a bit after. Sons of Liberty is a very special game, arguably the most important video game ever made. So important that it's hard to even know where to begin discussing it. It is structurally fantastic, the cold open with Snake being subverted into a totally different story. The ending sequence wherein it is revealed that the main villain is the reactionary miasma of the American populace given consciousness and pulling the strings behind all the world events is genius. The presentation is stunning throughout, with the best soundtrack in a series with phenomenal music already, sleek UI, and some of the most breathtaking cinematography in any game. The stealth gameplay is at its best in the series up until this point, with a myriad of complex and interesting contextual systems only hampered by the addition of the first-person shooting mode, removing some of the game's challenge. To tell you everything I thought praiseworthy about this game will be to give away the entire narrative, to explore every single facet of it. There's really very few parts of it that I think don't work. It's pretty heavily misogynistic, as Metal Gear tends to be, but far from the worst the series would ever get. The incestuous plotline with Otacon's half-sister is incredibly strange, and Otacon's entire presence in the game past the opening hour or two in general feels a bit forced. I do wish there was a bit less tedium with navigating the big shell, but it doesn't bother me too much. This all leads into another thing I adore about Metal Gear Solid 2, however. A lot of things I find strange about it could also be argued as part of its overall identity. It's a weird game wearing the coat of one that's more straightforward, and it's one of the most profoundly dissonant experiences one can have in the medium. The ultimate in meta-commentary on the role of the player in games, in a game that was so terribly misunderstood at the time of its release that it forever sank the Metal Gear series into a mire that it could never climb out of. And here's the mire. I often get strange looks when I cite that Snake Eater is my least favorite of the Metal Gear saga. After all, it is the most popular game in the series. And there is genuinely a lot to like about the game, even if it didn't mesh with me. The stealth systems have an immense level of depth to them, and there are a lot of fun details to the boss fights and the gameplay that lead to interesting emergent situations, such as being able to damage one of the bosses by leaving out poisoned food for him to steal and attempt to replenish his health with, or being able to kill one of the bosses way earlier than his boss fight and prevent the fight from even occurring. It's also very pretty, and while the music is a step down from Sons of Liberty, it's still pretty good. My only major gripe with the gameplay is the camera, which the game doesn't feel as if it was designed for. I hear that the Subsistence re-release is a much more frictionless experience in that regard. The cinematography is lost in that version, but this game does a little interesting with the cinematography regardless. All that being said, Snake Eater fails for me because it fails at the crucial aspect of art. It's not really about much at all. There is a thematic conflict at its core about loyalty to one's country and its implications, and how it's so beautiful that the boss gave her life for the promise of a better future, but the boss is an idealistic hack who died for nothing. It's really bewildering to me that the fundamental conflict of the entire Metal Gear saga after this point is framed around how two different people interpreted her desire for the future, because her desire for the future wasn't really compelling or noteworthy. Her entire dream was simply for world peace. That's not a compelling ideological positionality to ruin the entire planet over. She didn't die beautifully as a martyr, she died as a useless pawn. And though that is an interesting way to examine the game's narrative, the game doesn't really see it that way. It sort of retroactively makes the rest of the series a lot stupider, and represents everything I dislike about Metal Gear post Sons of Liberty. It's pretty evident that that was supposed to be the last game. Well, that aside, there are some cool parts of the story, like the quote-unquote fight with the Sorrow, and I particularly love Ocelot's entire presence throughout the narrative, as I always do in the Solid games. The ever-present triple-sided Spectre's origin finally unveiled, but ultimately there's not much here to talk about. It's a game that serves as an origin story where there didn't really need to be one. A trite explanation for conflicts that didn't need to be explained. Ghost Babel is a game that I accidentally ended up playing after Sons of Liberty and Snake Eater, the simple reason being that I didn't realize that it was as close to a mainline Metal Gear game as it is. The narrative isn't canon to the overall timeline, whatever that means. It's not bad and feels in the spirit of the series. The stealth gameplay is a fun mixture of what the 3D games brought to the table and what the original Metal Gear games were doing. It's also one of the most impressive games on the Game Boy Color from a visual perspective, an utterly gorgeous work that evokes some odd nostalgia in me despite having never played it prior to this year. Gorgeous color grade and fluid movement. Pretty solid all around. I like it more than the first two Metal Gear games. The material circumstances under which I played this and the following game are ones that I won't recount. They were very hard on me and a period of my life that I find hard to recall for many reasons. During this time, the original NieR was a panacea to that tension. It provided a means by which to escape the tribulations that I was presently facing. It's a game I still hold in high regard in spite of my criticisms of it. That being said, its sequel, NieR Automata, did not grip me in the same ways. It's hard to explain why. Automata leans a lot into some annoying writing trends more so than even its predecessor. The misogyny is dialed up even more than it was in NieR, with how every single female character is sexualized to some degree, and the way in which the narrative is framed and told is a lot less compelling to me. The wide open areas are difficult to navigate in ways I didn't find interesting. The side quests are similarly repetitive fetch quests, but without the JRPG meta commentary that made the first game's take on that work as well as it did for me, and the multiple playthroughs don't resonate with me in the same way they did in NieR. Each playthrough is now not a reiteration of a cycle of violence, but a different character perspective, which is cool on paper. A lot of my favorite games are anthology games, and I've spoken before as to how cool I find that particular style. With that being said, one of the character stories is wasted with a retread of the first 10 hours of the game, and then for the remaining 3 routes you play the same story over and over, much like NieR. I didn't really mesh with the characters as much here either, and the overall positive, nihilistic, and absurdist ideologies presented throughout the game, while compelling on their own, didn't really affect me in any way due to how commonplace they are as the ultimate philosophical meat of text within gaming spaces right now. The moment-to-moment gameplay is nothing to write home about, but that wouldn't have affected me all that much if I were more interested in everything else. There's a lot about the game I do like, however. I think NieR's soundtrack is much better than Automata's, but I still think Automata's soundtrack is excellently composed. It's hard to go wrong with Keiichi Okabe. I like a few of the environments, particularly Yoko Taro's most blatant attempt at copying Fumito Ueda, yet with the Eco Castle, which is a very pretty area. Everything surrounding the machines was really compelling to me as well, and if the game had chosen to focus more on them and their strange and eerie distortions of human society, I would have found that much more intriguing. Unfortunately, Automata's fixations do not lie with the plight of Pascal so much as they do with its idle pontification, and while it's not necessarily one of the worst games I've ever played, it does little for me. The other game I played in those less than ideal circumstances I just mentioned. A very funny companion to the NieR games. It's a skateboarding game with some fairly involved mechanics that are satisfying to master, complemented by some pretty solid map design. It really captures the emptiness of American city landscapes perfectly. I haven't played any other skateboarding games, but I've heard it's really unique for the genre in terms of how the player expresses themselves through play, vastly different controls that focus more on realism than style. It's funny to break your bones, and it's funny to hear the phrase blowing trannies in a video game. As with most kinds of action game, I am not too fond of Metroidvania as a genre. The games I do like within the subgenre are often ones that eschew conventional Metroidvania design for a greater purpose, like Metroid 2, or were foundational to it, but many of its most interesting elements weren't picked up in later instances of the genre, like Castlevania 2. It's no surprise then that I didn't particularly care for Blasphemous. It's a beautiful game aesthetically, but it has all the worst parts of FromSoft's oeuvre with really none of the positives, particularly this game's fixation on gratuitous erotic violence. The gameplay is fine, but nothing particularly captivating. There's not much to be said here other than it's probably best to play a different 2D Metroidvania that takes a lot from Souls by playing Hollow Knight again than give this the time of day, and that's coming from someone who doesn't particularly care for Hollow Knight. One of the most beautiful games ever made, brilliantly realized, silently powerful. Some of the best compositions ever composed in terms of score. The first level theme is one of my favorites in any game. The game's dedication to feeling like an alien world by crafting an entire fictional language to texture its spaces is admirable, as are the beautifully presented desolate landscapes you fly through. Immensely satisfying game to go through, with rail shooter mechanics perfected. The lock-on system that defines this game's gameplay loop has such satisfying sound design and control that's hard to play a rail shooter without it afterward. The game is incredibly difficult to be sure, but its brevity means that's not a huge burden on the player's part. Add in some very well-directed cutscenes and interesting musings on the nature of humanity's hubris through creating creatures of fantasy as weapons of war that lead to near self-annihilation, you have an excellent mood piece. Utterly fantastic. A lot of the same sentiments held here as with the first game, but I'm not as big of a fan of it. I'm not entirely sure why, but I think the extra elaboration and narrative drama detracts from the game overall to me. The moment where Lagi the dragon takes flight for the first time is cool, but the subdued nature of the original Panzer Dragoon was something that I really adored about it. That being said, it's still a really solid and well-presented experience, just not one that I'm as interested in as the first one. The forest level is really sick. Continuing the trend of on-rails games on the Sega Saturn, Nights into Dreams is an evocative game that defies genre to this day. One of the prettiest games I've ever played. Much like Panzer Dragoon, it's more so a mood piece than anything else, though even the discourse that Panzer Dragoon had at its disposal isn't really present here. Nights is much more a surreal audio-visual experience than a thesis on any particular idea, aside from just the general concept of being able to do whatever you dream, which is fairly standard. That being said, it is utterly gorgeous, and the ways in which you control the titular Knights are still fairly unique. It's closest in genre to a flight sim mixed with a rail shooter, but even those descriptors fail at what it's doing. Looping around rings and solving the puzzle-like bosses, each with solutions that seem esoteric at first but are really simple once you grasp them, is a very fun time. It's an eclectic railroad that also requires an immense amount of skill to see its conclusion, a dream defined by its arcadey gameplay loops and design. It also has an amazing soundtrack. It's fairly often that I'll play contemporary indie darling and not quite understand what the praise was for. Far less often will I end up having one as a favorite game of mine, like Undertale or Disco Elysium. To the Moon is one of the first of this modern wave of Western indie game development, largely inspired by the RPG Maker scene that had started in Japan a decade prior. To the Moon is an incredibly amateurish game where the positives just boil down to having a few fun puzzles for you to engage with as you go through the game. Everything else about the experience is pretty miserable. One of the worst written games I have ever played. Dialogue laden with references and out-of-place humor usurped only by one of the other games that I will discuss in this video. Some of the most baffling and gross plot developments of all time, including a woman dying of cancer because she had autism and hyperfixated on a lighthouse too hard. It's a game that I couldn't even bring myself to finish in spite of its short length simply due to how terribly it's written throughout. It does have a pretty good soundtrack at the very least. Journey is many things. It's visually evocative in so many ways. One of the most gorgeous games I've ever played. In turn, it also has a pretty good soundtrack, which I find myself saying a lot in this video. While these two things did make playing through it a delight, however, it feels as if it's missing something. It's ultimately a very empty trek up into the mountains, and one that feels like so many other Western indie titles, though that's through no fault of its own as the progenitor of the form. It's just not a very compelling form to me after being inundated with it so many times. By no means terrible, but also not very compelling in any way. When the ending plays and frames the experience as if some ultimate revelation about the human condition has been made, I didn't really feel much of anything. Perhaps I simply got bad luck with the players that I met on my particular journey, as they often ran away before I could do much of anything with them. My girlfriend was so deliriously tired during the events of this playthrough that she insisted that I get devoured by a non-existent fish within the game's diegesis, so at least it has that memory going for it. Portable Ops is a bizarrely designed video game as a follow-up to Snake Eater on PSP. It plays similar to the Subsistence release of Snake Eater, but the control scheme is a bit tough to get a handle on due to the use of a D-pad instead of an analog stick for camera control. It's not as much of a crime as, say, the Katamari Damacy games on PSP, but it is an awkward thing to adjust to with no real interesting usage of that awkwardness. That aside, structurally it is the second mission-based Metal Gear game after Ghost Babel. Though while that game maintains an illusion of an interconnected facility, this game takes place in several different locations across the map, with different mission objectives objectives and a system of capturing recruits for your base in order to bolster your numbers. Though I've yet to play Peace Walker, I know it builds on these mechanics in some way. That being said, I didn't find them particularly fun or interesting, and really just confusing to interface with. Narratively speaking, it's an odd sequel to Snake Eater as well. It follows Big Boss once more, along with the codec call cast from Snake Eater for some inexplicable reason, and largely only serves to introduce us to Roy Campbell before he became the colonel that would appear in many of the series' other entries. While there is a larger plot about the US government involving itself in Cuban affairs illegally, it is less critical of the institutions of the United States' imperialist fascism than I would like, and more so just uses it as set dressing for Big Boss to go through gameplay scenarios. The definition of forgettable, which is the opposite of what Metal Gear should be. Katana Zero is a game that feels largely derivative of Hotline Miami in its construction. Similar aesthetic fixations on a similar premise of a protagonist being a participant in a Vietnam War-esque event and examining the violence they commit in response to those traumas. With that being said, Katana Zero is a much better game than Hotline Miami, the perspective of the main character being the Vietnamese equivalent as opposed to the fascist American forces that Hotline Miami glorified in some ways. Katana Zero is also just a really fun game, with the player using the ability to slow down time to create fast-paced combat scenarios, each individual room of the game a puzzle for you to solve with the contextual environmental aspects in mind. Slicing through enemies with the mouse cursor never stops being satisfying, and effectively solving a room and seeing a replay of your execution of it is always fun. It's also very pretty aesthetically and has a great soundtrack. That being said, the game still falls flat for a lot of reasons. While the narrative is entertaining enough, it's nothing special, though some of the ways the dialogue is presented are fairly unique, mainly through how the main character can interrupt others and how different dialogue options disappear over time. It ultimately just ends up feeling needlessly gratuitously violent, similar to Hotline Miami, but at least the violence here is a lot more righteous than that game's self-misery. Simply one of the funniest games to ever be developed. Panzer Dragoon Mini is an experience that's difficult to explain. It's easier to understand what makes this game so funny if you simply play it, but essentially it's an attempt at converting the Panzer Dragoon series to the Game Gear. Attempt does a lot of heavy lifting here. While the core gameplay of Panzer Dragoon is somewhat intact, the challenging structure and focus on hard-hitting presentation are completely missing from this. It's hard to blame the developers, but it really does end up feeling like an incomplete piece once you hit the final screen, containing one of the few words in the game and it's mistranslated as congratulation. Not an utterly terrible time if you choose to seek it out, but a strange moment in Panzer Dragoon's history and one that will pass through you almost instantly. Sega has been a large blind spot in my ludography for the course of my life, one of the apocalyptic side effects of the irrevocable crime that is being a Nintendo child. This is something that I have begun to rectify largely over the course of this year. Knights and the Panzer Dragoon games were just one expression of this attempt to make amends with Sega. However, there were a few smaller games that I engaged with as well, one of them being Crusader of CTI, known as Ragna CTI in Japan, and Soleil in PAL regions for whatever reason. Crusader of CTI is way better than it has any right to be, an odd portrait of a dying dream. Set in a fantasy world on the brink of collapse, though not obviously so, there's a nostalgic hue to everything in the game's world, backed by some of the greatest compositions on the Sega Genesis. The game's brilliant art direction and soundtrack instill a forlorn sense of longing, and the game's wistful narrative about the nature of prejudice and the ultimate creation of a space for monster self-determination slots in with those feelings nicely. A particularly memorable sequence from the game is when the player is transformed into a monster themselves. They must navigate what it means to be a monster in the world of Crusader of CTI for a few hours, hunted relentlessly by heroes. Add to that fun mechanics involving momentum-based platforming and the various bespoke ways you can modify your character through the Animal Buddy system, and you have one of the best adventure games of that console generation, absolutely better than its contemporary which it was pitted against, A Link to the Past. A really good game. Very similar aesthetically to its predecessors, though with a much larger scope. Some of the prettiest environments and music in any game, with the addition of incredible vocal performances, even if something is lost by the concession to make them in Japanese as opposed to the fictitious language of Panzerese. Building more on Zwei's direct narrative approach, there's a much larger focus on the plot here than there ever has been in any Panzer Dragoon game. After all, it is a turn-based JRPG with a massive world to explore now as opposed to an hour-long arcade rail shooter experience. However, as much as I love this game, I do prefer those rail shooter experiences in many ways. The additional scope and detail to the world doesn't tell me much of interest I couldn't already glean from the initial outing on the Saturn, and the characters throughout aren't particularly memorable to me. Edge, Azel, and Kramen are all decently entertaining and interesting though, and the moment that the main hub area of the game is permanently destroyed as part of the game's climax is incredibly cool. There's a level of depth to the side quests that I admittedly did not engage with, if only due to their appealing esoterica making them inherently difficult to interface with on a first playthrough. The ultimate reveal of the narrative, that the entity guiding the plots of all the games that is introduced within this game diegetically was secretly the player, is neat, but it's not something that I really felt much connection to. Gameplay-wise, it has a very unique battle system unlike any other in a JRPG. The player uses ATB, but much like the rail shooters before it, much of the strategy comes into the player using positioning to dodge attacks. There are a few really cool fights utilizing these systems, including a missile that you barely have enough time to destroy, or the nightmarish Grig Orig, a boss from the first game being a terrifying war of attrition. This is all complemented by how the player can change the stats of their dragon on the fly in response to any situation. That being said, the game's combat drags on quite a bit toward the end, if you'll pardon the pun, with many of the fights feeling more like a formality than an interesting gameplay scenario. This is typical of JRPGs, unfortunately, but unlike most in the genre, Panzer Dragoon Saga fights never get any faster to alleviate this in any way. I feel as if the ending stretch of the game shouldn't have had really much combat, or at least not as much as it did have. Ultimately, it felt like a culmination of a narrative that I had little investment in, but it was all competently put together. Would recommend this trilogy to anyone interested in incredibly told stories in games. The team behind Crusader of CTI went on to make a few more games in its tenure as a game developer, but the only one that built on the mechanical identity established within that game was the Sega Saturn's Linko Story, or how it was likely meant to be translated, Wrinkle River Story. Linko River Story's mechanics are taken from CTI's in many ways, though the momentum-based platforming is totally eschewed and it's altogether much stiffer to play. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but in this game it's not particularly compelling or fun in the ways that Crusader of CTI had been. The story is much less of interest as well, less reflective of the dreamlike aestheticism than the last game was. While it's also often a juvenile series of loosely connected plot beats, they're far less surreal here. The soundtrack and visual design are breathtaking, however, and at times surpass even what Crusader of CTI was doing. The Land of Seasons in particular is just one of the best areas in a video game ever crafted. Ethereal game in many ways, just unsatisfying, especially toward the end when you face a final boss you're unlikely to have been prepared for. Have you ever loved someone so much you lost yourself in them? Have you ever tried to save something no matter what the cost? Have you ever given everything just to make someone happy without any thought to how it affected yourself? Has that affair ever been doomed from its conception? I've endeavored to play more Brazilian games in the past few years. The results of this have been largely positive. Unsighted and TOCita have quickly become two of my favorite games of all time. Dandara is one of the games I played for these purposes, and I have much more mixed feelings on it. The set dressing is incredible. Mythologizing Brazilian history is such a novel idea in the gaming space, and something I'd like to see more of. A retelling of the story of Dandara dos Palmares, a historical figure who is an escaped slave as part of the Quilombo, with the ending of her totally destroying the empire that enslaved her and her people is a powerful prospect. The gameplay itself is pretty well realized as well. A game you only play with your mouse as Dandara jumps between walls and fires missiles at enemies. This combines with some nicely intuitive map design to make one of the least annoying Metroidvanias ever made, which is an impressive accomplishment. The mouse being the main mode of control also ends up making the bosses more challenging in an interesting way. Having to manage your position on walls and firing at the same time in spite of your inability to do both at the same time is pretty fun. The game is also super pretty, with the true final boss Tormenta being astounding visually. My main conflict with this game, however, is its obsession with the works of other developers. Jonathan Blow being a minor NPC in this game is egregious enough, considering how awful he is as a person, but a significant portion of the story is dedicated to Yoshio Sakamoto, Koji Igarashi, and Hidetaka Miyazaki's spectral metatextual figures assisting Dandara throughout the game. This is such an absurdly tacky and stupid thing to put in the game. In order to get the true ending of Dandara, you have to appease each of them, only then being allowed to free the songbird to help you fight Tormenta. It's such an odd choice that's at odds with everything else. Why should Dandara have to appease the whims of random Japanese men from hundreds of years in the future in order to free her people? It's such a stupid and simultaneously prolonged aspect of the game that it brings the whole experience down a ton. It's still a fairly solid game though, generally. I'm not a fan of AVB's writing style. This colored a lot of my playthrough of We Know the Devil. I didn't care for the humor and actively thought it was annoying at times. Presentationally, the game is very pretty, in particular how it uses mixed media with real-world photographs, and in spite of my distaste for its writing, I eventually came around on the overall narrative. There's something really beautiful in how these people find themselves and their connection to each other, how they become themselves only by casting aside the shackles of societal expectation placed upon them. The ultimate merging with the devil and becoming a creature of infinite sapphic love that consumes the world is a beautiful and surreal prospect. Short enough that it's not too much of a problem that's vaguely annoying at times, and beautifully realized in most regards. I like this significantly less than We Know the Devil against all odds. I came into this piece wanting to enjoy it, wanting to see the well-written mecha story that I was told existed within this work. What I got wasn't really that, though it wasn't terrible. Again, I don't care for AVB's writing generally, but when it's a much longer game, a single playthrough being 4 hours in a game that must be completed several times to truly understand it, it becomes a lot harder to bear. Add to that the game's increased focus on world building and terminology that doesn't add much to the overall narrative, and you have an experience I value far less than the team's last effort. The art direction, while still competent, is less compelling to me here due to ditching the mixed media approach that made the last game so interesting visually, and the overall ideas feel like a more hollow version of what the first game is doing with regards to the inhumanity of queerness. But maybe I'm just too scared of mecha and Gundam conceptually to fully appreciate it. Did not help that I played through this game while going through one of the slowest yet most obvious breakups of all time with one of the worst people I've ever dated, something that colors my perspective of many of these games, but this one has suffered the most unfairly due to it. I had to travel across the ocean to my girlfriend's house in order to play through this game, making an already otherworld experience even more viscerally strange. To clear the air before I say what I wish to say about this game, I by no means endorse its existence. Guns of the Patriots is an awful game that is even more deeply misogynistic than the games before it, and would carry that thread with it to the end of the series afterwards, with some of the most disgustingly violent depictions of eroticism I've ever seen in the Beauty and the Beast unit boss fights. To even describe what's wrong with them would go beyond the scope of this video in terms of the feelings I wish to evoke in the viewer of this fairly lighthearted, casual script. Perhaps I'll write a separate piece on misogyny in Metal Gear that includes them, though it's rather self-explanatory if you've played the game. The narrative at large is also just poorly conceived in many ways, and obviously a rushed conclusion to the Metal Gear storyline, one that was mandated as opposed to being born out of a genuine passion. All of this aside, this game is incredible in how bizarre it is. Nearly every decision made by Metal Gear Solid 4 feels out of left field, and for the most part it is immensely entertaining and interesting to see those decisions. This game feels as if it's from an alternate dimension. Massively in-depth and satisfying stealth systems are included, but end up never being utilized as part of the game's thematic composition. The only two actual levels are the first two, and they are some of the best designed areas in Metal Gear, but they are quickly supplanted by levels that use entirely different systems for the rest of the game. A fully functional iPod is included, for whatever reason, complete with a podcast from two white guys who seem to not actually like Metal Gear all that much. The final mission is an hour-and-a-half long cutscene movie. In fact, the game's emphasis on cutscenes is its most memorable and interesting quirk. Kojima's a competent director who makes compelling scenes, but the game does end up feeling like an empty set of action set pieces that you don't get much control of. It's an astounding game that feels as if it dropped out of another realm due to its irreverence for game design convention in spite of being a huge AAA project, and some things like the final Tekken boss fight between Old Snake and Liquid Ocelot, or the final scene in the entire game, where there would normally be a cliffhanger as per Metal Gear tradition, simply being Snake and Otacon enjoying each other's company, are genuinely fantastic. A very intriguing and awful game. In a similar vein to something like Sayonara Wild Hearts, we have a playable album. Unlike Sayonara Wild Hearts, there's not much more to it than that, but it's a very pretty and well-composed playable album with some engaging gameplay to complement it. Vib-Ribbon is a very cute character to control, and with the game only being about 30 minutes long, there's no reason not to try it out for yourself. Custom tracks generated from CDs is a really neat feature as well. There's something a little postmodern about the game self-reflexively adapting other narratives into itself like that. Played very briefly while visiting my girlfriend and sitting on her couch. One of the most overstimulating video games I've ever played. Incredible in how it makes you feel as if you're thinking every thought you've ever thought in your entire life at the same time. A must-play for those who find non-normative gaming experiences interesting. Hard to describe anything about it because it all comes up in a technicolor haze, a glorious endless miasma of balance. In 2021, I played Mother 1 for the first time, as chronicled in my horrendous year in review for that year. I was really stupid then, so I had some really dull opinions about it. I imagine the me of then would have adored this take on Mother 1, because it seems tailor-made for people who don't like Mother 1. Mother Encore isn't a terrible game per se, but due to it building on the back of a much better game, it's much worse than it would be otherwise. Its art style, while competent, pales in comparison to the original. The new renditions of the near-perfect Mother 1 soundtrack feel too busy. The combat system is drastically overtuned in the player's favor, making what was once a terrifyingly large and dangerous world much more standard JRPG fare. Even the opening crawl where we learn the brief backstory of the game, the story of the two abductees from which our main heroes descended, is no longer the minimalist experience that it once was, now accompanied by technically competent art that makes it far worse overall. It's just a generally terrible interpretation of an amazing game in spite of the effort put into it. It doesn't help that the game has developed a pretty annoying culture surrounding it, and that has colored my perception of the work. But even removed from that, this is some pretty harrowing artistic violence for a project so lauded. Leave it to gamers. PLCape Torment is a new favorite game of mine, but it's also a game that has a bevy of glaring issues and is one that I occasionally think can't occupy as space as one of my favorite games due to it. It features a sprawling and interesting setting to explore with interesting discussion throughout on the nature of the self, but the game is bogged down by way too much writing surrounding its world building. It has some incredibly written sections of its text, but it is also absurdly and consistently misogynistic in ways even more exaggerated than its contemporaries. The game is almost entirely progressed through dialogue in a fun way that almost certainly inspired Disco Elysium, but there are forced combat encounters because the game is ultimately built on the flawed framework of Dungeons & Dragons. It is a game that is more flawed than most, even amongst flawed games, and one that I can't blame anyone for disliking. But there's a certain je ne sais quoi to the game's atmosphere and writing that is ultimately compelling to me. The game's discourse on the way ego changes is told through an immortal man who loses his memory each and every time he dies, only to find the remnants of his many lives over the course of hundreds of years, is an utterly fascinating one when one of the aforementioned issues doesn't arise. It's also a very consistently pretty looking game when it comes to the environments at least. The character models are one of the few times I can agree with people who find early 3D appalling, especially with how ridiculously misogynistic the proportions on the female ones are. Unfortunately, the combat is relentlessly punishing if you don't build your character in a specific fightery way, and the sexism is endless. A game I wish I could like more than I do, but if you're somehow able to look past its myriad issues, there is something meaningful here. Chimera Land is a Chinese MMORPG that is incredibly poorly constructed, which I played with my girlfriend out of an interest in playing more Chinese games. Unfortunately, thus far, that interest has not been sated with much that I found compelling, though the Chinese-developed Eastward, a game I played some years ago, is one of my favorite games ever made. Chimera Land is, however, one of the worst games I've ever played, but it is a whole lot of fun. There's something magical about how terrible it is, how awfully written and translated it is even on a technical, grammatical level, and how fun it is to experience its absurdity, like its insanely in-depth and limitless character creator with someone else. It's like all MMOs in that it has very little merit outside of being a vehicle to spend your time with someone you care about, but it's a very funny form of bad otherwise that makes it more enjoyable. A fun oddity to check out if you ever have the itch to. Another Chinese game, though this one is not as interesting as Chimera Land. Forged and Shadow Tor is a Metroidvania that isn't very special in most ways, mainly telling a story against Japanese imperialism during the Second World War. It is a fairly solid time though, and as you explore the world with your cyborg bunny, it never becomes totally dull. The writing is stale, as to be expected with video games, and while the environments are pretty, the character models leave a lot to be desired, reminding the player of something akin to Conquer Live and Reloaded. In particular, the female cat's character design is utterly abhorrent, one of the worst examples of an anthropomorphic animal girl being needlessly feminized compared to a male counterpart of that animal. There are some decently directed scenes, and the action combat has enough depth to remain fun all the way through. There's a recurring joke character who you never fight in the main game, but end up fighting in a secret boss rush mode, and that kind of thing is right up my alley. A decent time, but it could have stood to be shorter than 25 whole hours. Earlier while I wrote about To the Moon, I mentioned that there's only one game present in this video with worse writing than that game, and this is that game. The Messenger is a game with some fun qualities. It has a fun platforming kit to play around with, the Cloud Step being a cool way to gain an extra jump based on your reaction time to enemies or projectiles in the way while simultaneously dealing with that threat. If it were only its linear gameplay challenges, the Metroidvania structure that most of the game ends up taking notwithstanding, then it might be a decently fun game. However, there is contextualization in the gameplay, and that contextualization is really painfully bad. The Messenger is a contender for the worst written game I have ever experienced, which is really shocking. It's hard to describe how bad the writing is with words, an example of my own failings as a writer, but it is just the most insufferable and grating text that I think I've ever come across in games. Which is saying something when To the Moon and Supergiant's catalog both exist in the same medium. The worst part is that you're assailed with it every single time you die, each death another blow of intense psychic damage. A miserable exercise in self-harm that, for whatever reason, people enjoy. I really dread the full-scale RPG written by the guy behind this. Yepy Psycho is an interesting take on survival horror. It sort of reminds me of the Mother games in the way it approaches the genre. Not in terms of writing or ideological discussion, which of course Yepy Psycho pales in comparison to the likes of Mother as does pretty much every other game ever made, but the application of mundane contemporary aestheticism to survival horror as a genre reminds of how Mother 1 or 2 do the same with the JRPG. It's not as drastic a shift as Silent Hill contorts the mundane as well to create its environments, but Yepy Psycho is a bit more comedic in its interpretations. Health is restored by making coffee or getting water out of water coolers. One of the most damaging hazards in the game is interrupting an office worker typing at their keyboard, causing them to violently freak out at you. It's a fun backdrop for the game's decent puzzle solving and level design. The game is a fine enough plot, though its fixation on Wiccan folklore is something I could do without. Wiccanism being recognized as legitimate ideology and not the fetishization of the deaths of a bunch of innocent women is something that bothers me. All in all, it's a fun enough game with some fun level design and mechanics, and some of the artwork looks pretty competently drawn, though none of it stands out much. Peak fiction. Zenith of the medium. It doesn't get better than making hamster tracks with the love of your life. Overgrowth is a game intended to emulate the trappings of martial arts movies. Whether it does so or not effectively is not something that I can evaluate, as I have not seen a single martial arts movie in my entire life. What I will say, however, is that it ends up being an incredibly goofy experience laden with ragdolling, which is fun in its own right. The combat system of the game has a lot of depth to it, and though it's primed for constant comical mishaps, it is very fun to play. The incredible amount of empty space contributes a lot to my enjoyment of this game mechanically as well. I adore when games have a huge amount of space that does nothing. It adds a lot of mystique and wonder to the world. I have issues with this game's depiction of fantasy racism and gratuitous fantasy slavery, the violence of both being utilized tastelessly to shock the player, but as long as you skip all the context, then this game can be pretty fun to play through. I wouldn't blame anyone for disliking it due to those aspects, though. The final Chinese game that I ended up playing this year, and arguably the worst one, but still fun on a basic level. While Warm Snow is more aesthetically competent on a technical level than Chimera Land, Chimera Land's art direction evokes more feeling, and it doesn't have the satisfying gameplay loops that F.I.S.T implements either. Warm Snow is sort of a cardboard cutout response to Hades, a roguelike with a similar twin-stick action control scheme that Supergiant often employs. It's fairly generic and exceedingly easy, but much more fun than Hades simply due to being a much shorter run and the action being easier to read. That being said, it's rather boring outside of mowing down enemies, and the writing is rather poor, which seems to be a trend here. Hopefully someday Chinese games start to get better translations, but considering the overall state of video game writing at the moment, it seems unlikely that they will in the near future. Fun enough, but not really worth investing much time into. Resident Evil 4 is a beast that I have avoided for some time. I don't do well with body horror, which this game trades in extensively. Yes, even if Resident Evil fans like to pretend this game is not scary in any sense of the word, it is if you're sensitive to that kind of gore. That being said, Resident Evil 4 is an incredibly influential video game, with many games trying to emulate it, though many of them also eschewing the things that made it so popular in the first place for whatever reason, so I was bound to play it eventually. And it was alright. The gunplay and basic gameplay loop were entertaining enough, even if it could get really draining after a long period of time. Aiming in particular with Leon's shaky hands is fun, and I always loved tank controls as a mode of design. The story is stupid, and sometimes it ends up being quite funny, but most of the time it's just really boring. There are a few lines in this game that really make me laugh, some of them I regularly quote, but most of the dialogue I just find bland or trying too hard. It's not a terrible game by any stretch of the imagination, but it didn't do anything for me. At least it's a gorgeous game, almost hard to believe it was developed for the GameCube with how high fidelity it is in some respects. It does make the gore harder to stomach though. Breathtakingly beautiful. The de facto game for transgender lesbians. Only women allowed to play this one. Final Fantasy VIII is masterful in ways that most will never see, divisive due to it being a subtle, interconnected web of ideas that require a lot of faith in the game as a work and a lot of effort in order to untangle. It's a hard game to swallow for most, but for those who look, they'll find one of the most beautiful love stories ever put to ISO and one of the most nightmarishly realized reflections of our socio-political existence wordlessly told through gameplay systems. The space-time annihilation that Karl Marx theorized in his unfinished manuscripts is on display through every aspect of the game's world, structure, and mechanics. The junction system is a compression of time in and of itself, ourselves changing in relation to the moment-to-moment existence of the gameplay and our time being bartered in exchange for greater power. Only for that greater power to be squandered away within moments as spells or a finite resource tied to stats. Even money, the endless JRPG resource that's often piled on you without limits, is only ever received at the behest of your employers as part of a salary. Uematsu's score and Fei Wong's lyricism combined with effervescent visual direction that still outclasses most video games breathlessly shows us our only recourse from the constant assault that the roller coaster plotline and constantly interconnected and overwhelming world have planned for us is the deep love between people. It is only through being a lesbian that you can survive our postmodern existences. Better become a girl if you aren't one already. Pretty art direction and a decent soundtrack, combined with some technically impressive reactivity from the game, make this experience a fun novelty for a short while. The game does drag on for far too long, however, and intends to be much more than the short diversion that it would have been much better for being. And the entire script being complemented by stilted voice acting doesn't really help in not noticing how blandly and repetitiously written it is. Not a terrible game by any means, and some of the particular segments are even a little touching or frightening, but for the most part it's fairly unremarkable. It's disappointing how so much of the mainstream Western indie scene right now is fixated on the reactivity of games above all else, but it is what it is. Res is a spiritual successor to Panzer Dragoon, and like Panzer Dragoon, it's a rail shooter that contemplates humanity's existence in relation to nature. Unlike Panzer Dragoon, it's set inside a computer system with the player taking the role of a virus. The orange wireframe aesthetic presentation is phenomenally well realized, making one of the prettiest Dreamcast games on a console full of gorgeous titles. The gameplay isn't quite as fun as Panzer Dragoon, but the lock-on system is still fun in almost any context, and playing perfectly to get to see new forms of your virus is exciting. The game is also much more rhythmic than Panzer Dragoon. Those games have undeniably good soundtracks, but Res integrates its soundtrack into the gameplay in a way that makes its OST incredibly compelling. Very well realized and satisfying game, even if there are a few sections that are unwieldy in ways that aren't particularly interesting. The remake of the original Panzer Dragoon is a funny experience to play coming off of Res. The original Panzer Dragoon is an incredible experience and one of my favorite games of all time, but the remake is an incredibly poorly made game. A very ugly take on a gorgeous work with some environmental changes that make one of the levels much more difficult to play as enemies come at you through the geometry, making them unable to be seen. It's not a terrible time because it's still Panzer Dragoon, but it's an awful take on Panzer Dragoon. Hopefully this team's work on the other games is better. One of the better games that I ended up playing released this year. Cosmic Wheel Sisterhood is a fairly cute game about usurping your coven using a tarot card deck of your own construction that allows you to shape the future with your predictions. It's an exploration of phenomenological thought in this regard, that we make our own futures and realities, but it's not a particularly in-depth or interesting one. It's pretty fun though, and has some cute art, and making your own cards and giving predictions is a great time, with finding a way to make your cards not look ugly as hell an interesting challenge. The political sim that the second half of the game becomes is designed in a way that isn't very interesting though, and it feels really out of place. Kind of like if a Supergiant game was tolerable and not totally grating. I adore the game's fake-out ending where it's all a dream that turns out to have been cooked up by one of your political rivals as a means of gaining information, and that moment was probably the highlight of the game for me. Another stylistically great game from the PS1. Ridge Racer Type 4 isn't a particularly interesting game narratively or thematically, but it feels good to play and has some really great art direction. The soundtrack is also killer. There are a few different stories that you could play through, but the one I played wasn't remarkable. Relaxing and aesthetically stimulating, but not much else. Might go back and play it again someday to see the other stories, and maybe those will provide something of more interest to me. One of the strangest Metroidvanias I've ever played. Captures the spirit of the show perfectly, which is pretty fun, even if I don't really care for said spirit of the show all that much. Only game I've played that has a laugh track. It has a surprisingly good soundtrack, and it's entertaining enough for an hour or two. The game is so forgiving that nothing feels like it has any weight to it, and therefore you truly become a slapstick cartoon for the 8 or so hours that it takes up. There's not a lot of depth here, but if you're expecting that, I'm not sure what to tell you. It's funny that Scooby-Doo needs to stand on his hind legs and use a shovel to dig up flowers even though he's a dog. Played this for a bit with my girlfriend while she was visiting me. It's a fun time. Oddly doesn't feel like it was designed for the Mario characters. They look as if they were modded into everybody's golf or something with how their models don't properly move with their animations, but that just adds to the delightfully odd aestheticism of the game. The open, empty, grassy fields are easy to get wistfully and spiritually lost in, and at the end of the day, golf is just fun on a simple mechanical level. It doesn't have the Flatwoods monster secretly hiding in the woods though, so it's far from being the best golf game with empty spaces to get lost in staring at. Kid Icarus is a better Greek game than God of War or Hades, and it's certainly better than Kid Icarus Uprising. It's an odd game on the NES, one that changes genres several times throughout its run. It begins as a platforming climb up through the underworld, and then becomes a dungeon crawler, and then becomes a lateral platforming trick, and then a dungeon crawler once more. The final boss is even a shoot 'em up. It's astoundingly pretty, the black background's tying the entire visual direction together, and even though it's a challenge, it's never too disheartening as you have infinite continues. Hip Tanaka contributes a wonderful score here as well, and it perfectly punctuates the events of the game. Underworld is still one of his best tracks, Mother One notwithstanding, of course. Turning into an eggplant is a comedically genius form of depowering the main character. One of the better NES-era platformers and criminally underlooked. It's a shame where Pit would go after this. Prior to last week, I had never played a single Jackbox Party Pack in my life thus far. Now I have played a single Jackbox Party Pack in my life thus far. Really fun with a group of people you already know well. I didn't play every game in this particular collection, but liked 2 of the ones I did. Job is cute and has a strong central idea. You have to answer interview questions using words written by other people. It ends up generating some pretty hilarious results. Weapons Drawn is a long-winded murder mystery detective story which was really fun to unveil all the mechanics of on the first go-round, though I can imagine that on subsequent playthroughs it wouldn't be nearly as entertaining due to its length. The only game that my group played that I wasn't a fan of was The Pole Mine, which was generally really unfunny in how it was written and was focused around teams in spite of its gameplay not being affected by whether or not you were in a group, since you couldn't conspire with your team members to vote for certain options. The final 2 games in the pack we simply didn't play, so no comment. It's sad to end the year on something so insubstantial, but I did play a lot of good games this year, so it's hard to complain. Hopefully next year brings similar fruit, but I'll probably spend most of it playing Final Fantasy XIV with my girlfriend when it comes to gaming. Sometimes it's just how the guy falls. This has been Arcade Everlasting, Snake Eater's most deranged hater, signing off. Thank you for watching.